The name's Bond, James Bond. But don't expect to hear that line in Quantum of Solace, the immediate follow-up to Casino Royale, and that's the least of its problems. Going into production without a completed script, putting cast and crew in harm's way, and running afoul of foreign dignitaries, 2008's Quantum of Solace remains one of the most maligned and doomed Bond movies in the franchise's 60-plus year history. So how did the cast and crew get out alive without just chugging a can of oil and calling it a day? Well, strap on into that Aston Martin, chug a Coke, and shine up your Omega watch, because we're gonna find out what the f*** happened to this movie. Quantum of Solace is unique among Bond movies in that it's a direct sequel, taking place somewhere between 2 minutes and 1 hour after the events of Casino Royale. Not surprisingly then, screenwriters Neil Purvis and Robert Wade's script was underway before cameras even rolled on Royale, giving them ample time to construct a brilliant script. And in that brilliant script, they set it so that Mr. White was being used as a pawn for Bond to get revenge for the death of Vesper Lynd. It also had a final scene where he was offed, but this was scrapped in case they wanted to bring White back in the future, and he returned 2 movies later, Spectre, but more on that shortly. And so director Roger Mitchell was hired, but later left the movie and a reported $8 million paycheck due to issues with this script. This essentially caused a delay, pushing the movie's release from May 2008 to October of that year. By April 2007, the script was complete, although Paul Haggis was brought in for a rewrite, saying he finished it, then titled Sleep of the Dead, just hours before the looming WGA strike launched in November. The eventual clunky title, Hey, It's No Octopussy, was plucked from an Ian Fleming short. With the script completed yet again, Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson had to find another director, with names like Jonathan Mostow of Terminator 3, Alex Proyas of iRobot, and Tony Scott of some of the best movies of the 80s, circling the movie until eventual replacement Marc Forster stepped in, initially turning it down because it was intimidating and he wasn't really a Bond fan. Yeah, hire the Finding Neverland guy for the gig. Great idea. Eventually, he signed on for a couple of reasons. He wanted to take up the challenge of doing a, quote, mainstream movie, and Daniel Craig won him over. One of Forster's major goals was to shorten and tighten the movie, saying the 144-minute Casino Royale was way too long, particularly criticizing the poker sequence. However, this is just one potentially skewed take on the length, which clocked in at a rather brisk 106 minutes. Realistically, since Forster wasn't known for action, his control over such sequences is a bit scattered and even hard to follow, with many of them feeling rushed and chaotic with a nauseating amount of cuts. Such a style-faced criticism from die-hard Bond devotees, who found it too akin to the Bourne movies. And let's not forget the fact that, the movie didn't even have a finished script. How can you get material on the screen if it's not on the page? There too were doubts from major players, with Broccoli and Wilson agreeing the story lacked focus. And there too were some notable deleted scenes. The biggest change came in the aforementioned ending, which originally found Bond killing Jesper Christensen's Mr. White. This would have positioned Quantum for a sequel itself, as Guy Haines was also arrested. This is where Bond would have said his catchphrase,
Bond, James Bond.
But this ended up falling victim to the cut. Oddly, this is where Forster placed the gun barrel sequence, traditionally at the beginning of Bond movies. Not only that, it drew major backlash for Bond being too fast. Perhaps this was another way of Forster hustling the pace? On a similar front, one could easily point to Forster's future World War Z adaptation, which faced such drastic cuts prior to release that it changed the tone and characters dramatically, in the hopes that the studio would have a more marketable movie and wouldn't ruffle any feathers overseas. For example, the sheer machismo of Brad Pitt was altered significantly so as to make him more of a family man, while the origins of the outbreak removed any reference to China so as to capitalize on their box office revenue. Forster also wanted to go inward with Bond and drive up the emotional stakes. Craig himself said Bond didn't, quote, give a fuck by the time the events even started. Forster also said that too many people traveled nowadays, so the locales weren't as exotic as past entries.
Mi nombre es Félix Peñaranda y hago el papel de taxista en la película.
And there too would be political elements and eco-friendly themes like Bolivian water issues, Haitian turmoil, and the concept of oil as king. As for the cast, Craig's second Bond outing made him a self-proclaimed caretaker to the character. Ukrainian actress Olga Kurylenko would be Bond girl Camille Montez, beating out 400 other potentials. The character was designed to be a counterpart and not the typical eye candy, while Kurylenko also took inspiration from Michelle Yeoh in Tomorrow Never Dies. Regarding Camille Montez, she is infamously the most prominent Bond girl not to sleep with 007, something that also generated controversy from the core fanbase, and probably Bond himself. After all, how could Bond not bed a babe? Another gal who garnered some buzz was M16 agent Strawberry Fields, played by Gemma Arterton. Visually, her hair has drawn comparisons to Bond's wife Tracy in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, while her death is clearly an homage to Jill Masterson's gold-painted death in Goldfinger. Two women Bond definitely shook, not stirred. Although that came from Arterton's words that there was, quote, so much wrong with Bond women. Strawberry should have just said no, really, and worn flat shoes. Remember, Quantum of Solace came out just 2 years after the first usage of Me Too. Mathew Plale would be main baddie Dominic Green, edging out Bruno Ganz, whose motives are partly lifted from Roman Polanski's Chinatown, and he modeled his character after politicians like Tony Blair and Nicolas Sarkozy, after he was strictly forbidden from having any distinct features that would scream villain, like a scar or a bald head. There too would be Joaquin Cosio as General Medrano, and Jesper Christensen as Mr. White. On the good guy front, there was Giancarlo Giannini, Jeffrey Wright, although his screen time was cut short due to rewrites, and Judi Dench, who saw a substantial increase in screen time. David Harbour also has a pretty fantastic early role, which helped pave the way for works in The Green Hornet, The Newsroom, and many more. Alfonso Cuarón and Guillermo del Toro also cameo.
You know, there are people in this country spending half their paycheck just to get clean water.
As for the crew, some key ones were replaced, namely Peter Lamont, who worked on 18 previous Bond movies, earning an Oscar nomination for The Spy Who Loved Me. He ended up retiring after Casino Royale. Recruiting Coen brothers' favorite Dennis Gassner, the idea was to develop a style that paid homage to famed Bond production designer Ken Adam, while also being, quote, a postmodern look at modernism. Forster also brought in Roberto Schaefer as cinematographer. He, like his director, had very little experience with action. Forster also ditched costume designer Linda Hemming, who was part of the Bond team beginning with 1995's GoldenEye. Major fashion names like Tom Ford and Prada would design outfits for Bond and the females, respectively. By the time cameras rolled on Quantum of Solace in January 2008, January being a Broccoli tradition, at the famed Pinewood Studios, the script was far from refined. And since they couldn't hire a writer due to the strike, even forcing Forster to consider quitting, the director and his star were tasked to write, which is never a good thing. But they did at least get rid of the revelation that Bond was the father to Vesper's child. As Craig put it, we had the bare bones of a script, and then there was a writer's strike, and there was nothing we could do. We couldn't employ a writer to finish it. There was me trying to rewrite scenes, and a writer I am not. As he also put it, we were fucked. Thankfully, once things cleared up with the WGA, Forster brought in Joshua Zatumer, although his techniques included adding lines based on ideas from the cast during rehearsals. Second unit began in Italy. filming, with 14 cameras, the famed Palio de Siena race, although Forster didn't know what he'd do with it until later, further demonstrating the lack of preparation among the team. Tens of thousands of people were in attendance, but it was later restaged with 1,000 extras digitally upgraded to 40,000. One of the draws of Quantum of Solace would be the action, with Forster pushing more chase sequences, even though movies like Stranger Than Fiction aren't exactly brimming with them. Thankfully, stunt coordinator Dan Bradley was on board, utilizing cranes and stabilizers that could withstand 100 miles an hour to capture the thrills. There's a dogfight shot with a 360-degree camera, a skydive scene which ditched green screen altogether, rooftop chases filmed on actual rooftops. But of course, Quantum of Solace wouldn't be without further troubles, some life-threatening. On April 19th, a driver took what can only be considered a wrong turn and wound up crashing a $265,000 Aston Martin into a lake. That same week, a head-on collision sent a stuntman to the hospital, resulting in 15 stitches. There too was a fire at Pinewood, although it may not have directly affected Quantum. Some played it off as realism, but really it's just serious and with dangerous liabilities.
He's dead.
Bond himself didn't get out unscathed either. This time around was a far more physically demanding go for Craig, who trimmed down and wanted to do some of his own stunts. For his efforts, he wound up with a severed fingertip, 8 stitches on his face, and a black eye. Some publications cited it as part of a Bond curse, which Craig said was fucking offensive. Still, Marc Forster maintained the production went very smoothly. Yeah, it sounds like it. Oh, and while filming in Chile, a Sierra Gorda dignitary objected to the implication that one region could double as Bolivia, storming the set and nearly running over crew members. He was quickly disposed of and arrested for trespassing. Similarly, Bolivian minister Pablo Gru went off on the film for its portrayal of its citizens as drug dealers, even though it's one of the major drug trafficking countries in the world. Despite it all, production on Quantum of Solace wrapped in June 2008, leaving just 6 weeks to edit. While some editing was being done during production, there was still the matter of visual effects, with the likes of Framestore, Double Negative, Machine FX, and the Moving Picture Company helping achieve more than 900 shots. As for the Bond theme, that would go to Jack White and Alicia Keys, marking the first duet for a Bond song ever. Bond would have to wait until Skyfall for its first taste of Oscar glory, as Another Way to Die was pretty awful, making one wonder if the Amy Winehouse demo, snipped over the songstress's legal issues, would have set a new bar. James Bond and the Quantum of Solace premiered on October 29th, 2008, opening in the UK on Halloween and in the States on November 14th, taking opening weekend with $67.5 million. Although it dropped 60% the following week, it would stand as the highest grossing Bond movie domestically at the time. It also broke the UK opening weekend record set by Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. It would eventually go on to gross $590 million worldwide. As for critical and audience reactions, Quantum of Solace holds an unremarkable 64% from critics and a 58% audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. Roger Moore himself went after the movie, saying there was too much flash and called it confusing. Fans of the franchise openly criticized it from multiple angles, including the aforementioned lack of Bond girl hanky-panky and the gun barrel sequence. There too was the issue of product placement. Obviously, there would be plenty of Aston Martin action due to Ford's 3-film deal, with 12 total Aston Martins being used, at least 7 of which were totaled, or, flung into a lake. But there was also eye-grabbing spots for Coke, Omega, Virgin Atlantic, and Sony, who launched a full-blown nationwide promotion that made it all the more tacky. And while Marc Forster was far from game at the onset, he retroactively said he was happy with how Quantum turned out, putting him in the minority. Daniel Craig, meanwhile, said, quote, "You could say we've had a run of bad luck, but most of the time it's great. Being Bond has changed my life in ways I never could have expected." And so James Bond would return in Skyfall, the production of which was far too normal by comparison for an episode of What the Fuck Happened to This Movie?